Everyone laughed when she bought a strange house in the bitter cold. People expected her not to survive the first night. But when they looked inside, things didn't go according to plan. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which country you are watching from. Eliza's life did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. There was no sharp crack, no clear before and after. Instead, it thinned out, like ice melting from the edges of a lake, retreating so quietly that at first she did not notice how much ground had been lost. The reduction in hours came first, explained away with careful phrases about restructuring and temporary adjustments. She accepted it without protest, telling herself that work had always moved in cycles, that patience was a form of intelligence. When the reduction turned into a layoff, delivered with a sympathetic smile and a folder of papers that meant nothing to her anymore, she nodded again, thanked the supervisor who avoided her eyes, and walked out into a parking lot that felt too large for one person. She believed, for a while, that effort alone could reverse the slide. She took short-term jobs that paid just enough to create the illusion of momentum, worked evenings and weekends, told herself she was only passing through a narrow stretch of difficulty. Bills accumulated quietly, stacking themselves in corners of her apartment, like objects that did not want to be noticed. She paid what she could, delayed what she could not, and learned the exact tone a phone call took when it shifted from courtesy to warning. Friends expressed concern in the abstract, in messages that ended with promises to meet soon, to talk properly, to help if they could. Those meetings never happened. Concern, she learned, was a renewable resource that required no follow-up. The loss of her apartment came not with shouting or threats, but with a conversation that was almost gentle. The landlord explained the situation as if it were an inconvenience they shared, a regrettable necessity imposed by numbers rather than choice. Eliza listened, nodded, asked for a few more weeks, and received them. When she packed, she did so without drama. She moved slowly, choosing what to keep and what to abandon, discovering how little of her life could be reduced to boxes. The final walk through the empty rooms felt unreal, as if she were trespassing in a place that already belonged to someone else. She locked the door behind her and stood in the hallway for a moment, holding the key, before placing it carefully on the floor by the frame. The building was warm. That, she would remember later, was what hurt the most. For a time, she lived in motion. Nights were spent in her car or on borrowed couches, days in libraries and cafes where the heat was free and questions were rare. She learned the geography of the town in a new way, not as a place of destinations, but as a map of tolerances, where you could sit without buying anything, how long you could stay before a glance turned into a request. The most frightening realization was not hunger or fatigue, but the absence of a door that belonged to her. There was no space she could enter and close off from the rest of the world. Everything was provisional, dependent on permission that could be withdrawn at any moment. The idea of the house arrived without ceremony. It was not a vision or a revelation, just a notice glimpsed while she waited in line at a municipal office, killing time she no longer knew how to value. The board was cluttered with papers that advertised lost pets, language lessons, surplus sales. One small sheet of paper, printed in plain black text, caught her attention only because it did not try to be interesting. It listed a structure for sale on the edge of town, classified as a temporary agricultural or utility building, not recommended for residential use. The price was so low it seemed almost insulting. There were no photographs, only an address and a date. She told herself she was curious, nothing more. Curiosity, after all, was harmless. When she walked out to the site days later, the sky was low and gray, the kind of sky that pressed down on the landscape until everything felt unfinished. The building sat alone on a narrow plot of land, separated from the nearest houses by a strip of frozen ground that no one had bothered to claim. At first glance, It looked less like a home than an artifact, something that had been misplaced. It was squat and compact, its proportions odd, the roof rising steeply from thick walls and covered in weathered straw that had darkened with age. The door was low, forcing her to bend slightly when she stepped inside. The interior was small enough to be comprehended at once. There was no open plan, no attempt at modern comfort. It felt deliberate in a way she could not immediately explain, as if every inch had been argued over before being allowed to exist. The air smelled dry, not unpleasant, and the walls were thicker than she expected, swallowing sound in a way that made the space feel isolated from the outside. She stood there longer than she intended, listening to nothing, aware of the way her own breathing filled the room. The reactions came quickly once word spread. People did not hide their amusement. Some laughed openly. Others shook their heads with a kind of pity that felt more condescending than cruelty. A neighbor from a nearby house asked her, not unkindly, whether she understood how cold winters could be here. Another remarked that the structure was little more than a shed, that it would not last a single serious frost. Eliza answered politely, thanked them for their concern, and did not argue. She had learned that explanations invited debate, and debate required energy she could not afford to waste. Signing the papers felt strangely ceremonial. The official who processed the sale barely glanced at her, reciting the conditions in a monotone that stripped them of meaning. Temporary structure. No guarantees. Not suitable for habitation. Eliza signed anyway, her hand steady, her mind oddly calm. When the keys were placed in her palm, their weight surprised her. They were light, almost insignificant, and yet they represented something she had not possessed in months. Ownership, however precarious. That night, she returned to the house with a small collection of belongings and a sense of resolve that bordered on stubbornness. She knew what people expected. They expected regret, panic, a quick retreat to warmer, safer arrangements. She told herself that if she failed, she would fail on her own terms. The thought carried a strange comfort. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, she closed the door behind her and leaned against it, listening to the muted sounds of the town settling into evening. The house did not offer luxury or reassurance. It offered only enclosure. For the first time in a long while, that was enough. She lay down fully clothed, her coat wrapped around her like an extra skin, and waited for the cold to claim its territory. Outside, the wind moved across the open ground, testing the walls, searching for weaknesses. Inside, the air remained still. Eliza kept her eyes open, counting breaths, bracing for the inevitable. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a thought took shape, quiet and insistent. Whatever happened next, this place, unwanted and underestimated, was hers. And in that simple fact lay the beginning of something she did not yet have words for. The expectation of cold had followed Eliza into sleep like a presence with weight and intent. She lay still, wrapped in layers that restricted her movement, waiting for the familiar tightening in her chest that came when the temperature dropped enough to turn breathing into work. The house was silent except for the faint sounds of the night outside, the wind moving through dry grass, the distant creak of branches stiffening under frost. She told herself to stay alert, not to drift too deeply, because deep sleep was dangerous in places like this. People did not wake up from it. At first, nothing happened. Minutes passed, then an hour, measured not by a clock, but by the slow rhythm of her thoughts. She shifted slightly, expecting the air to bite at the newly exposed skin. It did not. The cold pressed against the walls from the outside, but it did not seep inward the way she had known it to do in unheated rooms. The difference was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the pause between two notes of music where the absence itself carried meaning. She closed her eyes and focused on her body. The ache in her joints was there, the fatigue that had settled into her bones over the past months, but the sharp edge of cold was missing. Her breath did not bloom white in front of her face. The air felt dry, steady, neither warm nor hostile. She sat up slowly, half expecting the illusion to shatter with movement. The floor beneath her feet was cold, but not painfully so, and when she placed her palm against the wall, she felt something that made her pull back in surprise. The surface was not icy. It held a muted neutrality, as if it had never learned how to surrender to winter. Eliza laughed once, quietly, the sound more reflex than joy. She told herself it meant nothing. Thick walls, good insulation, perhaps luck. People had survived in stranger structures for centuries. She lay back down and waited again, this time for fear to return. It did not. Sleep came in shallow waves, broken and cautious, but it came all the same. When she woke, the light filtering through the small window was pale and gray. For a moment, she did not remember where she was. Then the shape of the ceiling, close enough to feel personal, brought it back. She sat up quickly, bracing herself for the rush of cold that should have greeted her. Instead, the air felt much as it had before she slept. She exhaled slowly, watching the absence of vapor, and frowned. Outside, the world had hardened overnight. Frost coated every surface, turning ordinary objects into fragile replicas of themselves. Her breath caught as she stepped out, the cold immediate and aggressive, a reminder of what she had expected to face inside. She stood there, wrapped in her coat, and looked back at the house. It gave no sign of effort. No smoke, no sound, no visible concession to the weather. It simply stood, unchanged. Throughout the day, she tried to explain the experience away. She spent hours inside, then outside, comparing the sensations, testing her own perceptions. Each time she crossed the threshold, she felt the same subtle shift, as if she were stepping out of a current into still water. The difference was not dramatic enough to inspire wonder, but it was persistent enough to erode doubt. By evening, the sky darkened again, heavy with the promise of another severe drop in temperature. The second night was colder than the first. The wind rose, pressing against the walls with a steady insistence that made the building groan faintly. Eliza prepared herself as before, layering clothing, rationing the small reserves of heat she could generate through movement. She waited. Hours passed. The house did not yield. The air inside cooled slightly, enough to be noticed, but it stabilized quickly, holding at a level that remained survivable without effort. She slept more deeply this time, waking only when a sudden gust rattled the door. In the morning, she noticed details she had missed before. The walls, when touched, did not draw warmth from her skin the way stone or metal would. The interior surfaces remained dry, free of the condensation that plagued unheated shelters. Even the sound within the house felt different, absorbed and softened, as if the structure itself were participating in the act of sheltering. Days followed with a rhythm she had not anticipated. Each night brought colder temperatures, and each morning confirmed the same improbable result. The house resisted. Eliza began to observe it the way one might observe an unfamiliar animal, cautious not to startle it. She noted the way snow accumulated on the roof, then slid off in uneven patches, leaving dark streaks that contrasted with the white. She compared it to neighboring buildings, whose roofs held their burden until the weight threatened collapse. She began to measure things, not with instruments, but with her senses. How long it took for her hands to numb outside compared to inside. How quickly her breath fogged when she opened the door. The consistency unsettled her more than any dramatic failure would have. There was no obvious explanation she could reach for and discard. Each rational possibility frayed under repetition. One evening, as the temperature reached a point that made the news station speak in warnings rather than forecasts. She sat against the wall and listened. At first, she thought she imagined it, a faint tremor beneath her back, like the vibration of distant machinery. She shifted, pressing her palm flat, and felt it again. It was subtle, steady, not the erratic shudder of wind or settling wood. The house seemed to hum so softly it could be mistaken for silence. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she lay awake, tracing the sensation with her attention, following it through the walls, the floor, the ceiling. It did not grow stronger or weaker. It simply existed, a constant presence that made the house feel less like an object and more like a system. By morning, she was no longer trying to deny what she felt. She was trying to understand it. The thought that took hold of her was both frightening and strangely comforting. This place was not merely sheltering her by chance, it was doing something. The realization did not come with excitement or triumph, it came with caution. If the house could do this, then it had limits, rules she did not yet know. She spent the day examining every visible surface, running her hands along seams, counting boards, noting irregularities. She found nothing overt, nothing that explained the impossible steadiness of the interior air. As night fell once more, Eliza prepared herself with a different mindset. She was no longer bracing for failure. She was waiting for revelation. The house remained unchanged, its quiet resistance to the cold unwavering. Outside, the town retreated inward, lights glowing behind windows, heaters working overtime. Inside the small, unwanted structure on the edge of things, Eliza sat awake, aware that the question was no longer whether she would survive the winter night. The question was what kind of place she had stepped into, and why it had been left for someone like her to find. By the time Eliza accepted that the house was not behaving like an ordinary structure, the cold had settled into the region with a severity that erased all remaining doubts about winter's intentions. The forecasts no longer spoke of passing fronts or temporary drops. The language had hardened into absolutes, sustained extreme temperatures, prolonged exposure risks, stay indoors if possible. The town complied in its own quiet way, retreating behind walls and radiators, sealing itself into routines built around endurance rather than comfort. Eliza watched it all from the edge, aware that she was now living in a place that defied the rules everyone else depended on. Each day followed a similar pattern. She woke to the muted gray light of morning, stepped outside long enough to feel the cold bite into her skin like an accusation, then returned inside and closed the door with a care that bordered on reverence. The shift was always there, not dramatic, not miraculous in the way people imagined miracles, but undeniable. The air inside did not fight the cold. It ignored it. As the days passed, she began to keep mental records. How the interior temperature never dropped below a certain threshold, no matter how violently the wind screamed outside. How the walls, even after hours of darkness, never took on the numb, lifeless chill she associated with unheated spaces. She stopped trying to convince herself it was coincidence. Coincidence did not repeat itself with such discipline. She noticed the roof first. Snow fell heavily that week, piling high on every surface. On neighboring buildings, it formed thick, unmoving caps that bent gutters and strained beams. On her house, the snow behaved differently. It gathered, held for a time, then slid away in irregular sheets, leaving behind exposed patches of straw that darkened and dried quickly. The pattern was inconsistent, as if guided by invisible contours beneath the surface. Eliza found herself standing outside longer than was safe, staring upward, trying to understand why the house shed winter like an animal shedding water. Inside, The air remained dry. There was no dampness, no creeping condensation that turned corners into traps of ice. Her clothes dried overnight simply by being hung near the walls. The smell of the space never changed, never took on the stale, closed-in quality she remembered from sheds and temporary shelters. It was as if the house breathed, slowly and evenly, maintaining an internal rhythm separate from the world beyond its walls. The idea unsettled her. Houses were inert. They did not respond. They did not adapt. And yet, this one seemed to know something she did not. She began to explore more deliberately, not tearing things apart or forcing answers, but paying attention to details she might once have dismissed. She counted boards, traced the grain of the wood with her fingertips, noted how the corners joined with a precision that did not match the building's rough exterior. The craftsmanship was inconsistent in a way that felt intentional. The outside was crude, almost careless, but the inside carried subtle signs of planning. The walls were thicker than they appeared. When she leaned back against them, the sound of the wind dulled more than it should have, swallowed by layers she could not see. One afternoon, driven by a growing unease, she tried to map the space. She measured the interior with slow steps, then walked the exterior perimeter in the cold, counting again. The numbers did not align. It was not a dramatic discrepancy, not enough to suggest a hidden room at first glance, but enough to trouble her. There was volume missing, swallowed somewhere between the visible walls, space that existed without revealing itself. She searched for explanations in books borrowed from the small local library, pages that smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant. She read about traditional building methods, about insulation techniques used in extreme climates, about old designs meant to trap heat and resist wind. Some elements matched what she observed: thick walls, low ceilings, compact forms. But none accounted for the consistency. None explained the hum she had begun to notice more clearly now, a low vibration that seemed to live within the structure itself. At night, when the world outside fell silent under layers of snow, the sound was unmistakable. It was not loud enough to disturb her sleep, but present enough to demand acknowledgement. A steady, patient pulse that reminded her of distant machinery heard through the ground, or the faint echo of a generator running far away. She pressed her ear to the wall more than once, holding her breath, listening. The moment she pulled away, the sound seemed to retreat, slipping back into the general quiet. She asked questions, cautiously. An older man who lived 2 streets away shrugged when she mentioned the building, saying it had been there longer than anyone cared to remember. A woman at the corner store laughed softly and said it was just an old shed, nothing more. No one knew who had built it. No one claimed it had ever been used for anything of importance. The lack of history felt deliberate, as if the house had been erased, not by time, but by intention. The discovery came not as a revelation, but as an accident. Eliza was clearing a small patch of snow from the interior wall near the door, brushing away dirt and debris that had gathered in the narrow space, when her hand caught on something that did not feel like wood. It was subtle, a difference in texture that stopped her movement. She knelt and ran her fingers over the area again, slower this time. There was a seam, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Her heart began to beat faster, not with excitement, but with a sudden, sharp awareness. She pressed gently, then more firmly. Nothing happened. The wall resisted, smooth and unyielding. She stood there for a long moment, weighing the impulse to investigate against the instinct to leave well enough alone. The house had kept her alive. It owed her nothing more. But the question would not loosen its grip. That evening, as the cold deepened again, and the hum within the walls grew more noticeable, she returned to the spot with a small tool borrowed from a neighbor. She worked carefully, mindful not to damage whatever she might uncover. After several minutes, the seam yielded, A narrow panel slid inward, with a sound so soft it felt like a secret being exhaled. Behind it lay darkness. The air that flowed out was warm, warmer than the rest of the house, carrying with it a clean, metallic scent that reminded her of places sealed away from weather and time. Eliza stepped back, her pulse loud in her ears. She did not enter immediately. Instead, she closed the panel again and sat down, her thoughts tumbling over one another. The house was not just shelter. It was something else entirely. When she finally opened the panel again, she did so with deliberate slowness. The space beyond was small, no larger than a closet, but meticulously organized. Shelves lined the walls, holding binders and folders sealed in plastic. A single lamp glowed in the corner, casting steady light without any visible source of power. Eliza's breath caught as she stepped inside, the warmth enveloping her in a way that made the rest of the house feel merely temperate by comparison. She reached for the nearest binder and opened it. The pages were filled with careful handwriting, dense and precise, interspersed with diagrams that made her eyes ache with their complexity. This was not the work of a farmer or a hobbyist. It was engineering, rigorous and deliberate. Notes spoke of thermal regulation, of autonomous systems designed to function without external power, of materials layered and arranged to manipulate heat at a structural level rather than generated conventionally. The deeper she read, the clearer the intention became. The house was a prototype, an experimental shelter designed for environments where traditional heating failed. The crude exterior was a disguise, a way to hide complexity beneath familiarity. The project had been abandoned, the notes suggested, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. There were references to oversight, to decisions made far from the cold, to the necessity of concealment. Eliza sank to the floor, the binder heavy in her hands. The hum she had sensed before was louder here, resonating through the narrow space like a living thing. She closed the binder slowly and looked around, taking in the shelves, the careful order, the evidence of a mind that had worked tirelessly to solve a problem few wanted to acknowledge. When she returned to the main room and slid the panel shut, the wall became whole again, seamless and ordinary. The house resumed its quiet vigilance, holding back the winter as it always had. Eliza stood in the center of the room, the weight of what she had found pressing down on her. She was no longer merely surviving in an unwanted house. She was living inside a solution that had been hidden, forgotten, and left to wait for someone desperate enough to need it. Outside, the wind howled, and the cold continued its patient assault on the town. Inside, Eliza understood that the true test had not yet begun. The knowledge Eliza carried after discovering the hidden space did not bring her comfort. It sharpened her awareness, made every sound and shift inside the house feel purposeful, watched. She moved through the small rooms differently now, careful not to disturb the balance she did not yet understand. Outside, winter continued its steady advance, indifferent to what she had found. The cold did not know it had been outwitted in one small place at the edge of town, and it did not care. It pressed on, tightening its grip on streets, pipes, wires, and people. The first sign that something was wrong beyond her own quiet refuge came not with drama, but with absence. One evening, as dusk settled earlier than it had the week before, the usual glow from windows across the narrow street flickered, then went dark. Eliza stood at her small window and watched the blackness spread unevenly, building by building, like ink seeping into paper. Somewhere in the distance, a siren rose and fell, its sound distorted by the cold air until it felt unreal, as if it belonged to another place. She stepped outside long enough for the cold to seize her breath and listened. The town had not gone silent, but its sounds had changed. There was no hum of traffic, no distant laughter or music, only the wind, the occasional crack of ice, and voices raised in short, urgent bursts before retreating indoors again. When she returned inside and closed the door, the familiar steadiness wrapped around her, a quiet defiance that now felt almost fragile in its solitude. The news arrived the next morning through fragments. A transformer failure, an overload, a cascade of systems that had not been built to withstand this kind of sustained cold. The words were technical, detached, but the consequences were immediate. Heating systems failed. Water lines froze. Buildings that had survived decades of ordinary winters began to surrender. Eliza listened from the doorway of her house as neighbors gathered in small knots, their breath white and constant, their movements sharp with cold. She heard the same disbelief repeated in different voices. This had never happened before. It wasn't supposed to happen here. By afternoon, the cold had become an enemy with intent. It slipped into homes through cracks and corners, crept up walls, turned radiators into useless metal shapes. Eliza watched a man across the street drag furniture away from his windows, layering barriers in a futile attempt to slow what could not be stopped. She saw a woman carry armfuls of blankets to her car, as if motion alone might save her. The town was improvising, each person retreating into private strategies that did not account for how quickly isolation became danger. The first knock came just after dusk. Eliza heard it faintly at first, a tentative sound that almost blended into the wind. She froze, her mind racing. No one had ever knocked on her door before. The house had been invisible, dismissed. She approached slowly and opened it a fraction, enough to see the figure hunched on the threshold. It was a neighbor she recognized, a man who had once joked loudly about how long her shed would last. His face was gray with cold, his eyes unfocused with exhaustion. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply asked if she had heat. Eliza hesitated. The answer rose unbidden, simple and dangerous. Yes. She saw the fear flicker across his face, the relief that came with the possibility of survival. She stepped aside and let him in. The moment he crossed the threshold, he stopped, his shoulders sagging as if he had been carrying something heavy for far too long. He closed his eyes and exhaled a sound that was almost a sob. Words spread faster than Eliza had expected. It moved not through announcements or messages, but through instinct. People followed warmth the way animals did, sensing it before understanding it. Another knock came, then another. A woman with red, cracked hands and a scarf pulled tight around her face. An elderly couple moving slowly, leaning into each other for balance. Each arrival brought the same reaction. The pause at the door, the stunned silence, the release. Eliza's house filled with bodies and breath, the air thickening with presence. She watched the subtle changes with growing unease. The hum deepened slightly, the warmth shifting in ways she had not felt before. She remembered the notes in the hidden room, the warnings, written in careful handwriting about limits and thresholds. The house could do what it was doing, but it was not infinite. By the second night, the street outside had transformed. Cars sat abandoned where they had failed, their windows opaque with frost. People moved in groups now, faces rapt, eyes scanning for light. Some laughed nervously when they reached her door, disbelief edging into hysteria. Others were silent, too tired to react. Eliza let them in until the space could hold no more without becoming dangerous. She began to understand the weight of every decision. Each person she admitted increased the strain on the system she barely comprehended. The authorities arrived late, their presence announced by heavy boots and clipped voices that carried authority out of habit rather than effectiveness. They spoke of safety codes, of unauthorized sheltering, of the need to relocate people to designated facilities. Eliza listened, her back against the wall that pulsed faintly with contained energy. She did not argue. She pointed out the reality beyond the door. The shelters were full. Transportation had stalled. The cold did not respect designations. The officials exchanged looks that betrayed uncertainty. They were accustomed to control, to procedures that functioned under predictable conditions. This winter had stripped those conditions away. When they stepped inside her house and felt the warmth, their posture changed. Questions replaced commands. How was this possible? How long could it last? How many people could she keep alive here? Eliza had no easy answers. She had only the journals hidden behind the wall and the growing awareness that the house was not just shelter anymore. It was a focal point, a convergence of desperation and hope. She thought of the engineer who had built it, of the decision to hide rather than reveal, to protect an idea by making it appear unworthy of attention. The irony pressed hard against her chest. As the night deepened and the cold intensified, the town around her house seemed to contract. Sounds grew fewer, movement slower. The laughter that had once followed her purchase vanished, replaced by something heavier. Dependence. She stood near the door, watching faces she knew only in passing find relief within her walls. She felt the responsibility settle over her, not as pride, but as a quiet, relentless weight. When she finally closed the door against the wind, it was not to shut people out, but to hold together what she had already taken in. The house continued its work, steady and determined. But Eliza knew the truth now. The cold had come for everyone, and what she had found was no longer hers alone. By the third day of uninterrupted cold, Eliza no longer thought in terms of hours or dates. Time had collapsed into a sequence of decisions, each one demanding attention before the last had fully settled. The house, which had once felt like a refuge carved out of obscurity, had become a living system under strain. She felt it the moment she woke, even before she opened her eyes. The hum that had once been barely perceptible now pressed against her awareness, deeper and more insistent, like a breath drawn too slowly and released with effort. The air inside the house was still warm, but the warmth no longer felt evenly held. It gathered in certain areas, lingering near the walls and the low vents she had begun to recognize, while other corners cooled just enough to be noticed. It was not dangerous yet, but it was a change, and Eliza had learned to respect change in this place. She rose quietly, stepping around the sleeping bodies that filled the narrow space. People lay wrapped in coats and blankets, their faces slack with exhaustion, breathing slow and deep. Children slept, curled against parents, who had not let go of them even in rest, as if fear might steal them away the moment vigilance failed. Eliza moved to the wall, where the hidden panel lay concealed beneath ordinary wood. She pressed her palm there and closed her eyes. The vibration was stronger than it had been the night before, no longer a background presence, but a constant reminder that the house was working harder than it was meant to. She thought of the notes she had read, the careful warnings written in a hand that had known both pride and restraint. The system could sustain life in extreme conditions, but it was never designed to carry a crowd indefinitely. It was an emergency measure, not a solution to prolonged collapse. Outside, the situation worsened. The sounds that filtered in through the door when it opened told the story without words. Boots crunching through ice that no longer melted during the day. Voices rough with cold and fatigue. The occasional sharp edge of panic when someone realized they had waited too long to seek help. Eliza heard arguments break out on the street, people disputing whose turn it was to knock, who deserved entry more. She felt each raised voice like a physical blow. She began to limit the number of people inside, though the decision tore at her. She explained as gently as she could that the house could not hold everyone at once, that staying too long might endanger those already inside. Some understood immediately, their gratitude tempered by realism. Others reacted with anger, disbelief turning quickly to accusation. They pointed out that she was warm while they were freezing, that she had no right to decide who lived and who suffered. Eliza absorbed the words without answering. She knew they came from fear, but that knowledge did not make them easier to bear. The journals became her constant companion. Whenever the pressure grew too heavy, she retreated to the hidden space and read, searching for guidance left behind by someone who had faced similar choices. The pages spoke of balance, of thresholds that could not be crossed without consequence. There were descriptions of warning signs, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Changes in vibration, uneven thermal distribution, a sense that the structure itself was resisting further demand. Eliza recognized them all now, unfolding around her in real time. One passage stopped her cold. It described a secondary operational state, a reduced mode designed to preserve the core system under prolonged stress. The language was cautious, almost reluctant. Engaging it would lower overall comfort, narrowing the margin between warmth and cold, but it would prevent catastrophic failure. It was meant to buy time, nothing more. The notes were clear that relying on this mode required discipline, constant monitoring, and above all, acceptance that not everyone could be sheltered at once. Eliza closed the binder and sat back on her heels, the quiet hum filling the small hidden room. Her thoughts turned to the faces outside, to the people who had already come to depend on the house as their last defense against the cold. She imagined what would happen if the system failed completely. The warmth would vanish, the house would become just another unheated structure, and everyone inside would be exposed all at once. The idea hollowed her chest. When she returned to the main room, she gathered those who were awake and spoke to them plainly. She told them the house was reaching its limit, that she needed to change how it operated in order to keep it functioning at all. She did not speak of secret rooms or experimental technology. She spoke instead of fragility, of the difference between help that endured and help that collapsed under its own weight. The reactions were mixed. Fear rose quickly, but so did understanding. These were people who had already seen systems fail. They knew that survival often meant compromise. Together with two firefighters who had taken on the role of organizers by necessity, Eliza began to create a flow. People were allowed inside long enough to warm fully, to drink something hot, to rest until their shaking stopped. Then, if they were able, they were guided onward to other locations where partial heat had been restored or where emergency services could reach them. The house became less of a shelter and more of a passage, a place where life was stabilized before being sent back into the storm. The transition was painful. Each departure felt like a gamble, a calculation made under pressure with incomplete information. Eliza watched people step back into the cold with expressions that mixed relief and dread. Knowing she might never see them again, she told herself that keeping the door open to many for a short time was better than closing it to all after a single failure. The confrontation with authority came when she was already exhausted. A man arrived in a heavy coat, marked with the insignia of the municipal administration, his posture stiff with a sense of duty that had outlived its context. He spoke of protocols, of centralized control, of the need to take responsibility for what was happening on the street. He implied, without saying it outright, that what Eliza was doing bordered on reckless. She listened until he finished, then led him to the wall and opened the hidden panel. The warmth inside spilled into the main room like a held breath released. She showed him the journals, the diagrams, the careful handwriting that documented both capability and restraint. She explained the reduced mode, the limits, the risk of forcing the system beyond what it could sustain. She did not plead. She stated facts. The man's certainty faltered as he read. The language was unfamiliar, the implications unsettling. He realized, perhaps for the first time since the crisis began, that control was no longer a matter of authority, but of understanding. When he emerged from the hidden room, he did not issue orders. He asked how he could help. That night, as the temperature outside fell again, Eliza made the decision she had been postponing. With the firefighters at her side, she followed the instructions laid out in the journal, pressing concealed switches she had learned to recognize, adjusting settings she barely understood, but trusted. The house responded immediately. The hum softened, dropping in pitch until it settled into a quieter, steadier rhythm. The warmth receded slightly, enough to draw murmurs of concern from those inside, but it held. The walls stopped vibrating so insistently. The system stabilized. Eliza sank down against the wall, her legs trembling with delayed reaction. She had not solved the crisis. She had not saved everyone, but she had kept the house alive. As she looked around at the people who remained, wrapped in blankets, and watching her with a mixture of gratitude and fear, she understood the cost of what she had chosen. The house would endure, but only if she continued to make choices that hurt. Outside, the cold raged on, indifferent to the small victory achieved within a structure no one had wanted. Inside, Eliza stayed awake, listening to the gentler hum and knowing that the limit had not been a line on a page, but a responsibility she would carry with her, long after the winter loosened its grip. The cold did not leave the town in a single dramatic gesture. There was no morning when Eliza woke to sunlight pouring through the small window, no sudden softening of the air that allowed people to laugh at their own fear. Instead, winter loosened its grip reluctantly, as if testing whether it was safe to retreat. The nights grew marginally less vicious first, the kind of change only noticed by those who had spent weeks measuring survival in degrees and breaths. The wind still cut across the streets, but it no longer carried the same promise of finality. Ice cracked instead of groaning. Snow fell lighter, no longer piling with the same merciless intent. Eliza noticed the difference the way she noticed everything now, quietly, without celebration. She stood in the doorway of the house and felt the air on her face, gauging it not by comfort, but by threat. Inside, the system remained in its reduced state, the hum steady and subdued, like a heart that had learned to conserve its strength after illness. The house still held warmth, but it no longer pushed back against the cold with defiance. It endured. That, she understood, was enough. The town emerged slowly, cautiously, like an animal lifting its head after a long period of danger. Power returned in fragments. One block lit up, while the next remained dark. Radiators hissed uncertainly, as if surprised to find themselves alive again. People stepped outside and stood for long moments, looking at their streets as though they had been rearranged, while they were not watching. In many ways, they had been. Cars sat frozen where they had been abandoned, windows opaque with frost. Storefronts bore cracks where pipes had burst and been hastily sealed. The town looked older, worn down by something it had not been built to withstand. Those who had passed through Eliza's house returned when they could. Some came simply to check that it was still there, that the small structure which had held them together in the worst nights had not vanished like a fever dream. Others brought food, blankets, candles, things they no longer needed but could not bear to throw away after what they had seen. They left these offerings quietly, without ceremony, setting them by the door or pressing them into Eliza's hands with awkward smiles. Gratitude, she learned, was often clumsy. It did not know how to behave after terror. The laughter never came back, not in the same way. People still spoke, still joked, but the edge of dismissal that had once followed her purchase of the house was gone. In its place was something more careful. Respect, perhaps, though even that word felt too clean. What had replaced the mockery was an awareness that things could fail, that safety was not guaranteed by appearances or regulations or assumptions about how the world worked. The house stood as a reminder of that truth, low and unassuming, its straw roof still shedding the last stubborn patches of snow. Officials came, as Eliza knew they would. They arrived with clipboards and measured language, with expressions that tried to balance praise and control. They spoke of inquiries, of responsibility, of understanding how a structure like this had existed unnoticed for so long. Eliza listened without hostility, but without deference. She had learned the difference between authority that functioned and authority that merely occupied space. When they asked about the house, she told them what she could. When they asked about ownership, she answered simply that it was hers, purchased legally, maintained at personal risk. When they spoke of transferring it, of moving it to a more suitable location, she shook her head. The house, she explained, was not an object that could be relocated without consequence. It was not a generator to be unplugged and carried away. It was a system that relied on balance, on its relationship with the ground beneath it, on conditions that could not be recreated by decree. She did not exaggerate. She did not threaten. She stated facts, and when she could, she let the journal speak for her. The handwritten pages, worn from use, carried a weight that official documents could not. They told a story of intention, of restraint, of a refusal to trade lives for convenience. Public attention grew despite her efforts to avoid it. Someone had shared videos of the house during the worst nights, footage that once carried ridicule, now reframed with disbelief and shame. Comments shifted. People asked how they could help. They asked why something like this had been hidden. They asked why it had taken a woman with nothing left to uncover it. Eliza did not answer those questions publicly. She had learned that explanations offered too freely could be reshaped into something unrecognizable. A lawyer appeared one afternoon, a man who had spent a night on her floor, with his back against the wall and his coat wrapped around his knees. He spoke carefully, with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to systems and their weaknesses. He explained what ownership meant in terms she could use, what protections existed, what dangers remained. He offered his help without fee, insisting that some debts were better left unpaid. Eliza accepted, not because she trusted the process, but because she understood that endurance required allies as much as resolve. The inquiry moved slowly, bogged down by competing interests, and the uncomfortable truth that failure had not come from one mistake, but from many small assumptions layered over years. Eliza was called to speak, first in small rooms, then in larger ones. She described the winter as she had lived it, not as an anomaly, but as a warning. She spoke of the house not as a miracle, but as a tool that had been deliberately set aside because it disrupted established order. She spoke of the engineer who had built it, of the decision to hide rather than surrender his work, of the fear that innovation inspired when it arrived too early or in the wrong hands. She did not ask for recognition. She asked that the truth be acknowledged, that the work be studied, not sequestered, that shelters be built not as monuments, but as contingencies, ready to be ignored until the day they were needed. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The winter had already said everything she could not. When the formal apology was issued, it felt strangely hollow. Words could not restore what had been lost, nor could they erase the knowledge that some deaths had been preventable. Eliza stood among the crowd as names were read, her hands cold despite the mild air. She thought of the nights when the house had been full, of the way people had slept pressed together, breathing in unison, bound by nothing more than shared vulnerability. She thought of the engineer's handwriting, of the careful way he had documented both hope and fear. She wondered whether he would have been satisfied with what had happened, or whether he would have seen it as only the beginning of another struggle. In the weeks that followed, engineers came to examine the house. They moved with caution, their curiosity tempered by respect. Eliza remained present during every inspection, insisting that nothing be altered without understanding. She watched as they traced the layers within the walls, as they marveled at systems that did not conform to conventional models. They spoke in tentative language, full of possibilities and limitations. It was not a solution that could be scaled easily. It was not a promise of comfort. It was a design for survival. And survival, she knew now, was never elegant. Her own life shifted quietly. Opportunities appeared, not in the form of sudden prosperity, but as invitations to participate. She was asked to advise, to share what she had learned from living inside the system rather than merely analyzing it. She laughed at the idea at first, the sound surprising her with its unfamiliarity. She had no credentials beyond endurance. But she accepted, understanding that lived experience carried a weight that theory alone could not. On an evening when the snow had finally retreated from the sidewalks and the air carried the faint, tentative scent of thaw, Eliza returned to the house alone. The town was different now, its edges softened by recovery, but the house remained unchanged. She opened the door and stepped inside, closing it behind her with a familiarity that felt earned. The warmth greeted her gently, no longer assertive, but present. The hum within the walls was quieter still, resting, as if the house itself had learned from the winter. She sat on the narrow bench and let the silence settle around her. It wasn't the silence of abandonment she had once feared, but of completion. The house had done what it was built to do. It had endured. It had sheltered. It had held long enough for the world outside to remember how to function again. A knock came, light and hesitant. Eliza opened the door to find a man standing in the fading light, a bag slung over his shoulder, his eyes carrying the wary exhaustion she recognized immediately. He did not explain himself. He did not need to. He asked only if this was the place he had heard about, the one where people were allowed to rest without being judged. Eliza stepped aside and let him in. As he crossed the threshold, she caught her reflection in the small, imperfect mirror near the door. The woman who looked back at her was thinner, more tired, marked by weeks of vigilance and decision. But there was steadiness there now, a sense of position she had not known before. She was no longer someone waiting for the ground to give way beneath her feet. She had stood when it mattered. She closed the door and leaned against it, listening to the familiar, patient hum rise to meet her. Outside, the town continued its slow reconstruction, uncertain but alive. Inside, the house waited, as it always had, not as a miracle, but as proof. Proof that when everything else failed, something small and overlooked could remain. Proof that warmth, once found, did not belong to those who claimed it, but to those who chose to share it. If you stayed with this story until the end, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. More stories like this are already on the way, and new ones are released regularly. Watch the next video, explore the others on the channel, and share this story with someone who loves real survival stories. And tell us in the comments which country you're watching from.